Hi, I'm Chris,
And I'm Jimmy.
and we are the Two Stocky Guys.
On this channel, we put $1,000 into the stock market every week and cross our fingers that things go right.
Yeah.
But for this episode, we're going to talk about something else.
So we're going to talk about when being cheap is too cheap.
One of my answers is going to be when being cheap isn't giving you this mental reward. You know, like when you go thrift shopping, right? And you find this like great piece of clothing and you buy it and you're like, yes, you know, like you feel really good about saving that money. Or let's say you're a person who budgets a lot. And at the end of the week or the end of the month, you're just like calculating it all and you're like, oh my God, I saved X amount of money. Yes, right? So I think there's nothing wrong with being cheap because some people really enjoy it, right? They enjoy thinking about how much money they saved, how economical they are.
Yeah.
And I think that like, if you're not getting that yes at some point, then it's like, it's not worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, and if somebody calls you cheap and you take it as a compliment, that's probably
You're
a good
good.
thing.
Yeah.
You're good. But if somebody calls you cheap and you take it offensively, then, you know, probably not worth it, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then another point at which being cheap is too cheap is when the time that you're putting into saving money, you could actually be making more money by working or doing something else. So if you're sitting there like, you know, collecting aluminum cans or something that are worth barely any money, I mean, yeah, you're like saving money and you're getting like free money essentially, but could you be making more money by just working a little bit more or something like that instead of trying to save money? Like if you're sitting at home just thinking over all these ways that you could save money by getting 2-ply toilet paper and tearing it in half, and now you have twice as much toilet paper, I mean, how much money are you really saving at that point? But if you could be just going to your job or pulling a little bit of overtime or like working a little bit harder, you could probably be making more money than you are saving doing these really tiny marginal things. Yeah.
I saw this YouTube episode once about, you know, this doctor bought a rental property and he spent hours trying to fix the faucet. You know, even though he's like trying to save, you know, this small amount of money, he could easily hire someone else because he would be making more spending that time,
Right.
you know, his time elsewhere.
Yeah, you kind of have to figure out how much your time is worth and then say like maybe you're worth $50 an hour.
Right.
And you're putting 5 hours into something that only saves you $10, it's not worth it. So you kind of have to do a little bit of a calculation there and not just be so cheap about everything.
Yeah, and this is the concept of like opportunity cost.
Right.
As you're spending your time and effort being cheap or saving by being cheap, what are you giving up?
Yeah.
I think the calculation nowadays might be easier with the whole gig economy, right? Like instead of you like nickel and diming everything and spending all this time and energy doing something, you can be doing Uber or Lyft very easily, right? For most people, very easily.
Yeah.
And there's a certain price to that, right? There's a certain wage to that.
Right.
And if what you're doing is less than that, then maybe you should be thinking about
Doing that instead.
right?
Yeah.
Or some sort of side hustle or basically something else. But I think that now with the gig economy, it's something that's like readily available to a lot of people to do. And, you know, I don't even know how much they make per hour.
Yeah.
But there's a price. There's an average price that I'm sure people
it's something that you could do very easily in your spare time for a couple hours a day or a couple hours a week. Like you just pick up your phone and you go drive. Whereas normally you work a 40-hour week and maybe you can't get overtime or something like that. Like you're kind of boxed into what you can do with your time. But now it's pretty open. Yeah, with Uber, Lyft, you can even deliver food, like do random things. You can get on Fiverr and make stuff. You can do Rover. Like there's so many different apps, basically, like the gig economy, that you can just make money doing things for people, just being a handyman or something like that.
Yeah, I think the whole gig economy thing has given the world like so many more options to do in their spare time. Whereas before, you would spend that spare time thinking about how to save more money. You would use your spare time maybe like fixing up random things. But now you can use your spare time to actually make money. So the next thing I want to talk about is when being too cheap compromises relationships. I don't know, like if you're trying to be so economical that you're not going out when your friends go out and you're not making friends.
Right.
Or if you're so cheap that your significant other are breaking up with you, and that's the cause of relationship issues or social issues.
Yeah.
That's a sign that, well, maybe it's a sign that you need different friends or different significant others, but it could be a sign that you're just being way too cheap.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's like too cheap in this scenario is that I think a lot of people, they're being cheap for a reason. They want to save up so that they can live this life
Right.
that they imagine. And I assume that most people imagine a life with good social relationships, right? I don't think anyone wants to go like, oh, I'm saving up so I can retire early without any friends,
Yeah.
right? Or I want to retire early and alone.
Yeah.
I think that compromising social relationships it's just not worth it.
Yeah, I mean, it's great if you save a few bucks every month on your water, but if you don't get a job because you smell because you haven't showered in a week, probably not a good thing. Again, you could be making more money if you had gotten that job and spent a couple extra dollars on the water for your shower.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a common thing that people bring up when they're thinking about like, oh, these are the things you should save is that everyone says like skip your morning Starbucks,
Yeah.
right? Or skip coffee or skip something, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like everyone recommends skipping Starbucks.
Yeah.
But, and granted, there is a reason why lots of people recommend that because Starbucks every morning adds up.
It does add up.
Right.
I mean, it's like $5 or something like that. But honestly, I wouldn't be as funny if I didn't drink coffee before this. So there you go.
Yeah, and I think that people underestimate the cost. Like if you really need Starbucks to really like energize you, start your day and be productive at your job, that productivity is worth something. And that productivity might lead to a raise or better job security, right? So giving up Starbucks every morning might give you a couple thousand at the end of the year, at least on your books.
Yeah.
But it might really cost you that promotion or your job.
Yeah.
So it's like very easy to say, oh yeah, I could have saved $2,000-$3,000 this year, but you don't know if that cost was, a raise or a promotion or something else.
Yeah. Another point would be at which it starts to negatively affect your physical health. So, I mean, you can cut out a good amount of your budget by not eating out or, not going out and getting drinks at the bar every weekend or something like that. That's a good place to cut out money. But if you're deciding to live off of ramen noodles and Spam, I mean, those are things that are really high in sodium. There's not a lot of protein in it. So long term, it's going to negatively affect your health. And I mean, you could save a few $100 a year, on food, but how much is a heart attack going to cost you down the road? Or how much is it going to cost you if you just feel terrible all the time and you're not doing well at your job, or it starts to compromise your relationships again, like you just feel horrible all the time, or you never want to go out to eat, you don't want to hang out with your friends, no one wants to come to your house and eat ramen out of a cup with you. So again, at a certain point, if it's starting to negatively affect your physical health, if you want to cut out $25 a month on a gym membership, maybe not the best thing to do because, again, you have to look at it kind of long term. And in this case, the opportunity cost is very hard to quantify because your physical health doesn't really have a number to it. I mean, you can say like a heart attack costs $5,000 or something like that, but you can't say me feeling bad cost $1,000 or something. So there's really no number that you can put on your physical health, but it's something that you just kind of have to feel out. Like I don't recommend you go out and drink every weekend or you go out and spend tons of money on steak dinners or anything like that. And you can live off of ramen for a little while in college or something like that.
Right.
But it's not something that you can do long term. I mean, you don't want to sit down with your family and serve everybody ramen every single night. They're probably going to leave you at some point, which again, compromising a relationship.
It's funny because there's a lot of videos on YouTube and elsewhere about 25 cents per person per meal or something like that, right? Like they go super cheap. They're like, how low can you make or how cheap can you make an individual meal? And and it can go really low.
Yeah.
You can go like 50 cents, 30 cents, 25 cents or something. And a lot of that is like processed foods, processed carbs. And if that's the way you want to go, or you have to go, like you can go really, really cheap per serving, per meal or something like that. But there is a cost there, right? And the problem is that like that cost, like you said, is very hard to quantify, right? Like how many years of good living are you doing, right? Like of healthy living, like what's that cost on your lifespan?
Yeah. How many years are you cutting off your life by living this way for a little while?
And I think that by the time you're saying like, oh, that number of like the heart attack costs 5,000, well, it's probably like close to like 50,000 or something like that, right? By the time that number sort of like appears or vaguely comes, like it's generally very late.
Yeah,
it's generally too late. And I also think that this problem of like nutrition and like having good quality of food, this is something that is very prevalent in the U.S. where people without money or have a very difficult financial situation, they have problems getting like good meats, good vegetables, and they're eating a lot of the processed carbs, right? But if you're just forcing that on yourself because you want to be as cheap as possible, like that's probably not worth it in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I used to work at a pharmacy in a grocery store, so I would see what people had in their grocery cart, and I know the people that were lower income, they would have a lot of like frozen pizzas, soda, stuff like that, stuff that's really cheap, but it's really bad for you in the long term. So then, like, how much are you having to spend on medications to counteract that? So, I mean, you can that's something that you can put a number on, actually, is like how much are you having to pay for the ill effects that your health is having on you. And again, it could have to do with health literacy a little bit too, like people just not knowing how unhealthy this is. And you can eat very healthy at home for a fairly cheap price. So you just kind of have to weigh it, like, is this too cheap? Like I could make a meal for about $1.50 that's healthy and that I make at home. Whereas if I went out and got the same meal, I could spend $10, $15 on it. So you just don't want to be too cheap. That's the problem. Being cheap is fine. Being too cheap is the problem.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is when being too cheap alienates you and you feel like the oddball or the odd duck. And I emphasize the you feel part, right? Because like you mentioned earlier, sometimes when people call you cheap, you're like, oh, thank you, right? So sometimes like it's fine if you're cheaper than your friends or you're economical or more economical than your friends, and you're perfectly fine with that, right? Like as they're going out spending money, you're like, I'm doing a good job. I'm being responsible with my money. And if you feel good about that, about being like the odd duck, I think that's generally fine.
Right.
But if you start feeling that like, oh, I don't like this, like I don't like being the odd duck, right? Like I don't like how my habits or my spending habits is affecting me or affecting my relationships or something. Like if you start feeling negative about it, that's probably a bad sign. That's probably like you're probably doing too much cheap stuff. Especially if it's not if you're not forced in that situation, right? This is different if like all your friends are rich and you're poor, and you have to be very thrifty. I think that's a different story. But if you're just forcing yourself into this situation where you feel very negatively about your situation, I think that's a red flag.
I mean, how you feel is very important because, I mean, like we said, like if you feel good about being cheap, if you take it as a compliment, that's one thing. But if people are like, I don't want to hang out with him because he's so cheap, or it's like, I don't want to go, I don't want to go out with him because he's not going to want to split the bill every way, or he's just going to get water, or he's not going to do anything fun. Again, it can really start to kind of like hurt your self-esteem. And again, that's something that's hard to quantify. And you could get a year or two down the road and like awesome, you've saved a couple $1,000s, but now you feel terrible. Like you don't really like the person in the mirror anymore. And that's really important. I mean, to me, that's more important than money. I mean, you need money to live, but I mean, also feeling good about yourself is really important too. I mean, I would say like that's your mental health is pretty much as important as your physical health.
Yeah. I think, when after you're a certain age, like us, or maybe older than us, and you look back and you think about the memories that you have, like the good memories and also the bad memories, right? Like you think about the situations where you could have done something more, or like I wish I did that, and also like I wish I didn't do that, or something like that, right? But like you generally don't remember, oh, I spent an extra couple dollars on that, or I saved a couple dollars on this or that, right? Like yes, if you lost a lot of money, maybe you'll remember. If you spent, like, you got scammed or something, you'll remember. But you also like remember a lot of things that are associated with like relationships, right? And I think that that's important. So just like based on your memory alone, you can tell that relationships and social interactions are probably more important in your life, because you remember some of those, as opposed to some of these financial, especially like the smaller, more nitpicky financial interactions, because you probably don't really remember those.
Yeah. I mean, you can't take your money to the grave with you anyway. They're just green pieces of paper. Yeah. So another point would be when you don't really have a plan. You're just being cheap for the sake of being cheap, really. Like you just kind of get like that greedy, like cartoon character, like, oh, I just want the money. I don't want to spend money on anything. And you have no plan of anything to do with your money, and you just kind of stack it up or put it underneath your mattress or something like that. So you really need to have a plan, like why are you being so cheap? Why are you saving the money? Are you saving it to buy a house? Are you saving it to buy a car? Are you saving it to move into a better, safer neighborhood? Are you saving up for a child? Are you investing the money? Is the money that you are saving actually going to work for you, or is it just sitting there and depreciating in value? So I think a lot of times when people are too cheap, they do lack a little bit of financial literacy. Because, I mean, if you think about it, you could be making more money by going to work more, or you could be putting that money into something that's working for you. So if you're being cheap and saving that money and you're deciding to put it into stocks and it's making money for you, or it's helping you retire early, or it's helping you buy a rental property, that's a good reason to be cheap. But again, if you're being cheap just for the sake of being cheap, or just to brag about how cheap you are, that's not a good reason to be cheap. You have to be kind of intentional about it and have a plan as to why you're saving all this money, because money's not the goal.
Yeah, I think when you bring up that you should have a purpose for your cheapness, or the purpose for the money, or the utility of the money eventually or at some point, I think that brings into aspect like it gives you a value to your cheapness. Right, like it gives like a worth to it, right? Like I am sacrificing this, like I'm sacrificing A for B, and I know that B is better than A. Right. That's like the whole point of like long-term thinking or something, or retirement, right? Like I'm sacrificing A now for B later, and I like B later, right? But if you don't know what B is, then you don't know if it's worth sacrificing A for.
Kind of like delayed gratification. I mean, that's a very important skill to develop. But again, if you're just saving money for no reason, you're not delaying gratification. You're just, delaying yourself from being happy, really. Or you put too much value on money, period. And that could be a very bad thing also. If you're just, at that point, you're not being cheap, you're being greedy. And that would be an inherently negative thing.
I think that's it. I think that's all I have to say about it.
If y'all have any other points about when being too cheap is too cheap, then let us know in the comments below.
All right. Till next time. Bye. Okay.
Well, that was pretty good.
No, that's definitely a lot of stuff.
Yeah.